So we need each other, not because we're incomplete humans without each other, but we bring perspectives that support one another in being complete humans. And I am convinced that's true of a politically liberal and a politically conservative perspective. And I have to remind myself often that people who disagree with me about matters of politics have a gift for me if I can receive it.
Hello world, it's me, Dennis, and once again I have the immense pleasure of being on In Search of the New Compassionate Male. I get to produce some of these episodes, which means I get to attend, and I get to be here with the founder of In Search of the New Compassionate Male, Clay Boykin. Hello, Clay. Tell us who is with us today.
Hi, Dennis. Well, we have two people with us today, two wonderful people, Todd Porter and Christopher Howell. I'm going to say a couple of words about Christopher, and then I'm going to introduce Todd. Christopher and I have been together in our men's circle for several years, and I consider Christopher a bigger-than-life compassionate guy.
Amen.
Years and years in facilitation with people out in the wilderness and in the circles inside, and he and I are in a early phases of a nonviolent communications workshop study group, I should say, and Christopher is leading that. And Todd has been in the area of nonviolent communications or compassionate communications and doing workshops for, it looks like, about 9 years. And Todd, I understand that you're involved with the Charter for Compassion. Our friend Charlie Barker, I think, made our introductions. And you're on the board in Houston for the Nonviolent Communications organization there.
Yes.
And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Houston NVC.
Yeah, Houston NVC. And so welcome. When I first heard the word nonviolent communications, that term, it didn't land for me. And so I didn't really know what it was until we started to kind of delve into it.
So I often frame the workshops I'm presenting as compassionate communication, mostly because it's a little bit more commonly used word for what we're doing. Marshall Rosenberg is considered the founder of nonviolent communication, wrote a book that begins with that. I think you mentioned that book, Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life. And what he wanted to do when he wrote that was align the movement that he was starting with the legacy of Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and their work to move towards social change in a way that honored their commitment to peace and to nonviolence. And so that's the origin of it. And yes, often it's difficult to kind of make that connection. And it's a bit of growth to understand that violence, physical violence, begins not with the throwing of the first punch or the firing of the first bullet or the launch of the first bomb. It begins with the words and the thoughts that we have that alienate us from ourselves and from one another. And I think that was one of the unique insights that Dr. Rosenberg brought to humanity, is this realization that the way we talk to ourselves and the way we talk to each other holds in it the potential to connect us to life and to one another, or to disconnect us from both of those things.
I'm going to sit in that for just a few moments. I really like the connection to social change in a nonviolent way, that it's not just about improving your own self-communication, but the impact that has on social change.
I agree, Todd. I feel strongly what it's been with me is that it is a matter of vector. I can preach, I can work with everyone, but if I have not made peace inside myself, if I have not done the interior work with all of my discordant, angry, communication that is happening inside of me, I am nowhere near as effective as I could possibly be. And when I get to a pressure point, when I get to a place where I really need that peaceful, I don't have it.
You know, what strikes me is I love that you're saying compassionate communications. It's that lands for me. And when I've looked at Marshall Rosenberg, he works on the individual basis, but he's been involved in some massive, he's deceased now, but he was involved with some massive communications efforts, nonviolent communications efforts, bringing countries together, bringing people within a country together on a very large scale. Can you speak to some of that?
Yeah, some of the most troubled and war-torn parts of the world he has spent time in. And those experiences and his presence in places like the Middle East.
You're right. Israel, Palestine, Nigeria, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Belgrade, Bosnia, Croatia. And so what he's done, what he did in that whole evolution and going through that, he's brought all that wisdom together, in this book. And I guess he started years and years ago doing that. So he literally, worked around the world, and to be able to bring all that wisdom together and distill it down for small groups like what we're doing in our study groups, to be able to grab hold of that and make something tangible out of it, get it out of the air and out of the concept and into the practice. That's what I'm witnessing and learning within myself, a new language, if you will, that, we guys, the path from my heart to my mouth got shut off when I was a kid. Guys don't do that. We're up in our heads. And so I'm learning that language to be able to integrate my head and heart, and then to be able to speak and find those words. And that's what we're doing in our men's circle. We've been doing it since 2012. And this is an extension of it. And it's so welcomed, because we are speaking more from our heart. Now let's refine how we're speaking and how we're expressing ourselves. And that's what I'm witnessing in the study group that we're in.
I'm very interested in what impelled you to get into this work, Todd. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey, how you have grown into this, and what you have seen changing both in yourself and in the world, and getting into it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I'm sort of the nature of my way is to start about when I was born. I'm not going to do that. Occasionally I start with the foundation of the world. I don't do that either. So
we're going back to the Big Bang.
Yeah,
right,
I mean,
Todd.
It is kind of how it rolls with me, but I won't do that to you or the folks that'll come along and find us after this conversation. But I will say, in 2012, I was in the middle of an argument with some very dear friends that had gone on for about 5 years. And we had tried all kinds of things. We had tried everything we could think of, and we're not getting it worked out. I was in San Francisco at a training in meeting facilitation, and was off with a classmate for lunch, having a conversation. He was asking me, "What do you love?" And tell me about that. And so I did for like 45 minutes, and then asked him, "Well, how about you? What do you love?" And he says, "Well, I love to listen to people." And I said, "Well, you're pretty good at that." Haven't been doing it for 45 minutes with a stranger or somebody you just met. How'd you learn how to be good at that? And he handed me a copy of Marshall's book and said, "I want this back tomorrow, but check this out." And so I read it, got my own copy, read it, took it back into the middle of that 5-year argument. I'd like to tell you it solved all our problems. It didn't. And one of the crucial learnings from that I discovered is it's really important to have a place to practice those skills before you're in the moment of truth trying to apply them. And so that was kind of what set me on the path of teaching, facilitating, practicing with other people. I said to myself, I've got to find a way to be growing in this so that when those moments of truth come, I'm, as you were describing a few moments ago, Dennis, I'm ready, that I've got what I need to show up in those moments, both in skill and in presence and availability to what's alive in people. And so as I have looked at the world in the last 12 months and the last 8 years, really for all that I've known of the world, I see that compassion and connection are going to be key in the US and probably everywhere else to us being able to become a society where everybody's alive to themselves, alive in a way that sustains life, and living as humans with one another. And so all of those things, so this is kind of the linear story, the timeline version, and also kind of my motivation for continuing is I am desperate for a world that operates under the principles of compassion. And I think I might not be the only one.
I am also, and it appears to me, Todd and Christopher and Clay, that the argument against that can only be as if we are in a zero-sum world. That if I give up anything, if you take anything, it's got to come out of my pie. Whereas it has been proven to me over and over and over in 1,000 ways, whether it's hard economics or whether or not it's is that the world is synergistic, that 1 + 1 is greater than 2, that my making you and lifting you up lifts everybody up, including me. It's enlightened self-interest. I can get the best from me by bringing out the best in you. And so it's that switch of a mindset from that zero sum to a synergistic, interconnected, that I see as the opportunity. Todd, does that resonate in my worldview, or can you help me sharpen it?
It is deeply resonant for me that there is enough for everybody here. And one of the, I think, unique contributions that Marshall brought to this idea of connecting with life and with one another is this concept of universal human needs. And the thing he brings to us is this notion that everything we do as humans is in the service of some need. And the needs that I have, all of those same needs you have. And at any given moment, some may be more prominent. I mean, the physical needs, you know, I mean, they're really easy to talk about in terms of, you know, you run for some distance and you're out of breath. For me, it's not that far. For some of you, maybe you're a runner and you can go a long, long ways and not run out of breath. But, you know, there comes a point where you need more air. When you're hungry, you need food. Thirsty, you need water. And those are really easy to kind of get a hold of because they're such concrete physical experiences. But there are just as profound emotional needs that we have, and sort of needs for nurturance and community. And all of those things we share, and our differences around strategies for meeting them. Yeah, we all have quite the variety of ways we approach trying to get those needs met. But I've found that as I've asked the question, what need am I trying to meet here? What need is this person I'm faced with? What need are they trying to meet? And be able to give some words to those needs, and to look at feelings that are being expressed as kind of pointers or road signs or indicators, flares. Pick a metaphor. I got a bunch of them apparently. Mm-hmm. Pick a metaphor that they help us find the needs, find our way to the needs. And what we were talking about earlier, we were talking about Marshall's work in the Middle East and in these areas of conflict. He said repeatedly that he could get people connected in 20 minutes once they figured out what they were both needing. And if you go look on YouTube, you can find some examples of him doing that. He's got stories in his book about having done that. I'm not ready to say I can do that just yet, but I do know that when I'm committed to having your needs met, and I'm committed to having my needs met, not at the expense of yours, then there's lots we can do together. And I think that's what leads us to that sort of perspective or worldview of there's enough here. There's enough for all of us to have our needs met if we commit to one another that I'm not going to meet my needs at your expense.
You know, I so believe that. And at the same time, I don't know that I can think that big. Part of me says, well, yes, but, you know, what about the guy that's, you know, at the bottom of the hierarchy in needs? He's trying to put a shirt on his back. He's trying to put food on the table for his kids. He's in pure survival mode. And, you know, we've got people like that all over the world. You know, to be able to bring a person like that up to a higher level of consciousness, I mean, that just, how does that work?
May I jump in for 1 second, please?
Please.
You and I, Clay, had a man on from East Africa who was on, and here we are, two Western men who have our basic needs met. And we were asking him to help us because he was working in a peace initiative in East Africa. And he was talking about, and he was talking about how their children who were begging on the street just for be able to have enough food, who were running around. And yet he was talking exactly where you are, Todd. He was talking about the opportunity to have both the compassionate communication and also to be listening to what their needs are, and to be able that once we got there, and he showed us a light. He showed us a level of compassion. He fed us in our Western, he was feeding us. So I think that it's there, that Clay, how often do you talk about that people need to have, that people need to be heard? That is one of the deepest, most powerful needs that we have.
It just rings so often, whether it's said outright or it's implied. I just want to be heard. I just want to, that's what I hear crying out. I just want to be heard. And we see it in our men's circle. And that's why we set it up the way it is, where, you know, this is safe space. There's no judgment. Nobody's going to try and fix you. We're all learning, and we're learning from one another, and nobody's going to judge you. And that creates a safe space for me to be heard, for Christopher to be heard, for new fellas coming in to be heard. We all want to be heard. And so that's always on my mind. Now, can I turn it around and say, oh, this person I'm talking to on the street, he needs to be heard. You know, that's where the practice comes in for me. And I've got a long way to go with that.
Yeah, how human of you.
Mm.
Yeah, so Christopher here, but that's kind of what brought us to studying this. Was we had just come off of studying Kayla Saad's book, White Supremacy and Me, which had gone for an extended period of time, and it ended on, and so through that we got a pretty clear understanding. It felt like we could hear the Black Lives Movement very clearly. And for me, I walked away with it with, I can have a conversation with any person of color, and any person that's white, and be completely fluent in being able to communicate. the needs of what I'm hearing from BLM voice and ask questions and so on and so forth. But then we ended on January the 6th, which, as you remember, that's when Baga took over our election process, and for me, it was the same screaming voice as the protests that are happening with BLM. But I didn't have any idea. Well, I don't know what they're asking for, what MAGA's asking for. And so I discovered nonviolent communication. And the farthest I've gotten with it so far is just to be able to hear from people who I can't hear from now. I want to be able to just hear the voice of people that I've shut down and said, your voice does not deserve to be heard.
The thing that I love about this is Dennis, is that communication for me is a continuum. It isn't a binary state. It isn't that I'm either am communicating or not. It's that I'm communicating better along the spectrum. That's the reason why I feel much better about using the term waking than woke. Because it isn't a state. I'm continuing. I will continue to find another level of awareness to my compassion that I never knew was there a few moments before.
Yeah. I love waking versus woke. It's my new buzzword.
Well, I'd like to build on what Christopher.
What do you think?
Absolutely, waking. And I want to build on what Christopher was talking about is the studies that we've been doing. It was May 25th when George Floyd was murdered. And I've shared this before, but I'm compelled to share it again. It was on a Monday night, and we have our men's circle on Monday night, and we had no idea what was going on. And that night, the circle happened to be all white, middle-aged men. And we were sitting there, and the topic of conversation was aspirations. What are your aspirations in life? And when I got home, I didn't hear it until the next morning that as we were sitting in that circle, asking ourselves that question, George Floyd was being murdered. And things changed at that moment. We decided that our circle, which is pretty much a safe container, that we don't talk politics and we, don't talk about men and women relationships. No, this is about our inner healing, that something had to change. And we kept that circle there, but then we said, no, let's start this other circle. And that's what Christopher was talking about, where, me and white supremacy. And when I first heard that term, somebody said, hey, you ought to read this book. I was spitting nails. What do you mean I'm a white supremacist? And, if I didn't pause and take a look into that, I'd still be offended. But the fact that the privilege that I have, that I was blind to and becoming aware of, that's what we did during that time. And we were wrapping that up when January 6th happened. And Christopher said it, I said it, several of us said, we've got to take this to the next level. And Christopher found Nonviolent Communications, the book. And that's when we started that study group. So we've been pretty intense with it, this whole evolution of learning. And what really touched it off, what really raised the bar on us was George Floyd's murder.
Todd, how do you deal with your emotional triggers? Have you learned? I mean, as part of, I know I get triggered all the time, and I find myself, and I find this deep swelling inside of me, and how does that? Can you talk about that a little, please?
I can. And I think maybe what I want to say about it is most of what I know from watching other people do it well. And when we talked, you said a moment ago, to kind of describe this awakening as opposed to having fully awoken or being woke. And I think the same thing kind of applies here. And part of it has to do with our biology. Some of these, people are made to survive. Our bodies are made to survive. And so, we spent as a species a lot of time surviving wild animals that wanted to eat us. And part of the design to help us survive that is this circuitry that bypasses all our thinking when it gets triggered by a threat. And I don't know about you guys, where I live here in northeast Tarrant County, that there's not a lot of tigers and bears around here, but that doesn't completely alleviate my amygdala getting tripped. And all of a sudden I'm all spun up inside. So what do you do? That's the question here, is because it just happens, and it happens in our interactions with one another. And when it does, it's almost impossible to communicate from right there. And so the skills I'm trying to practice, again, with varying degrees of success, but this is the path I'm on, is to be aware of when it happens, to notice that's happened, that I'm spun up. Not having been in every conversation you guys have had together, I'm imagining if your life has been like mine, you've spent a lot of time working to not feel things. I know I have. And there are specific things that I've worked to not feel because they would cause me such trouble when I would feel them. And so to just keep functioning, I shut myself down and refuse to feel this thing and that. Telling myself, you know what, you're going to be overwhelmed and you're not going to be able to function if you let that out of the box.
Yeah.
And as I've done that, I'm still functioning. And so it makes me a little more brave the next time to take the lid off that box, let the monster out, and I'm still here. I haven't ceased functioning yet. And so getting more comfortable with that happening, being able to not just experience it and then unleash the kraken on all the people around us of whatever this distress we're feeling, but being able to say, hey, I am really upset right now. I'm furious. I'm irate, whatever and developing a vocabulary that's really nuanced about what those words are. So again, in my kind of emotionally constrained existence, I had sad, mad, and glad. It's like 3 colors to paint with. Who can paint a vivid picture of being human with just 3 colors? I mean, I get the whole red, green, and blue and common. I get that's a thing, but maybe you're following this idea of, no, if there's billions of hues of color and variation, I know it's that complicated in here. And so being able to recognize what I'm feeling, being able to give words to that, and then being able to recognize, how resourced am I in this moment? How many of my needs are met such that I can overflow and offer empathy to somebody else? Or is it in this moment that I'm, not only is my cup empty, there's a hole that everything I put in it drains, and it's like there's no healthy way I could engage this right this minute. And to tell somebody, look, I really want to be here for this conversation, and I can't do it right now. Can I step away for a few minutes and come back to it? Because I really want to be here. I want to connect with you. And I'm afraid I don't have what I need right now to do that. And then finally, once we've developed this sense of presence to ourselves, once we've got a way to describe what's going on and follow that string to the needs it's connected to that are met or unmet, that we begin to get to the point where we hear something that's triggering and our first reaction is something different.
Todd, I remember when I was a child, and even though English was not my first language, but when I was getting up into my 10 and 11 and 12, I would stutter, and I would find myself so frustrated because I could not express. I could not find the words to express that what would in someone, because I'm a deeply sensitive and deeply artistic person, to be able to say it. And I would get so angry and frustrated, and I would punch my fist into the wall, or my, and it was just, so I know that feeling, and that feeling at 73 carries to this day. I still will get, because that inability to find a word that will, and within enough nuance and enough to be able to express exactly what it is, because I need that. It's a deep need of mine. Christopher?
Yes, well, as far as I've dug into using this language, one of the early exercises is to write down an observation about yourself, and then to question whether it was an observation or an evaluation. Was it diagnosed, and have judgment and that kind of thing. And when I was able to just put an observation about myself, and I went ahead and wrote down my evaluation as well, so that could just be sitting on a plate next to me that I could eat if I wanted to. Otherwise, I could just eat what's in front of me right now. When I didn't judge the observation that I made about myself, I was able to get, as you were speaking to, Todd, genuinely curious, like, wow, what is it that I need here? What is the need underlying this demand that I am putting on myself and whoever I'm communicating with? And it changed the whole nature of the conversation internally and with the person I was communicating with.
What comes up for me is Todd, you were talking and I was listening to Dennis and Christopher. I keep coming up with the word flooded. That so often when things start happening, I want to stop. I want to stop because I can't absorb it. And that's a word that I've put in my vocabulary this year. And I'm still learning how to use it. But I'm feeling flooded, which to me means you may be speaking and giving me information. I can't pick it up. I can't hear it. I pause, slow down. Prior to that, I was more assertive to the point of being aggressive to shut it down because I couldn't hear it. I would push it away because I'd be in fear, because they would learn that I'm not understanding what they're saying and I can't respond. And then I feel foolish. And so that's something that I'm evolving into and learning. And that's helping, but there's so much more, like you were talking about, nuanced terms and the way to respond to it. Yeah.
Thanks, Clay. This is Todd. There's an example maybe for, I was kind of laying out this sort of process I go through to be present to myself, to first recognize that I'm being flooded, that there's more emotion than maybe I have the capacity to handle. And one option is not necessarily shutting it down. I've certainly discovered that's an unhealthy pattern for me, to not feel what I'm feeling. And so I'm not suggesting at all to shut it down in that sense, but maybe even just the time to take a breath and lean into what that feeling is, to experience it, leads us to sort of the application of this observation piece of nonviolent communication, where if you're to formalize nonviolent communication, you would start, as Christopher mentioned earlier, by just observing. And so in this case where somebody said something to you and you're feeling so many feelings that you can't even name one of them because there's such a variety and they're so like alive and present, the extent that you can just reflect back what you're hearing. So Clay, when you were I'm gonna try to do that right now. When you were talking about that, I heard you describe scenarios where in conversations you'd in the past shut them down yourself, just stopped the conversation, and that you have a longing to go beyond that. And the thing you're exploring here with me is, well, how can you even do that? That's kind of what I was hearing behind Dennis's question a few moments ago. What do you do when you've got all this emotion and don't know what to do? Is that kind of what you're saying, Clay?
The feeling that I just had as you were saying was, oh, he heard me. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And that in itself is both comforting and causing me to want to continue to engage. So yes, that was beautiful.
And so sometimes for me, as I'm triggered, as I'm flooded, as I'm overwhelmed, that very act of trying to just take it down to the observation, right? We're talking 5 senses. I heard you say, like, sometimes just doing that helps me sort of, the wave goes back out, right? And maybe I can have enough capacity before it comes back in to be present and to not be flooded when it comes back in. I hike up the beach a little bit and then I can watch it come in and out without getting all soaked.
It reminds me of what my granddad used to say. Now, Clay, count to 10 before you say anything. You know, there's such wisdom of that. Oh.
I know that I have this thing about needing this need to to be right, or to prove that I am on the right side, or to make someone else, to get them to come over to my way of thinking, as if that would be some kind of victory win. And it's so, and I find it so interesting when we're talking, especially when we're talking about the political divide. How do we get back to a place where there is respectful discourse? And maybe it's like Make America Great Again. When was it great? Well, maybe it was great for me, white male, at one time or another, but it wasn't great all the way across the spectrum. So when was there a time or a way that we could have discourse? We can disagree about we both agree on the what. All we're doing is working on the how. And really to be able to say, let's figure out a way we can get to the how together that is in a way that will work it in that way. And it's so important for me, because I don't believe that the people with whom I disagree with politically need one more brick of judgment on their shoulders. I don't see how that's going to help them in any way, shape, or form, no matter how good it will feel to me to be able to load it on there. It just does not work that way.
You know, Dennis, as you were talking, I'm reflecting back. I just got back from spending a few days with my brother and sister-in-law, and the first time I've seen them in a year because of all that's going on with the COVID and so forth. And they are small business owners. They are struggling to keep things going. They are very conservative. I tend to be more liberal. And I love them to death. I mean, and it wasn't the conversation, and it was with my sister-in-law. We stayed up till 1:30 in the morning having a conversation. And it was not about me convincing her of anything. And she wasn't trying to convince me or change my mind on anything. It was a dialogue. And it was about sincerely wanting to learn what the other person was experiencing. And what you said earlier, Todd, about, you know, what is your need? And, you know, how do you ask somebody what their need is? Well, I think by default, that's what I was doing. You know, she needed to be heard. I needed to be heard. We were in a space where we could create that spontaneously and not be judged. and not be said, no, you're wrong, or counterpoint, but just to hear and to feed into this dialogue, not to come to any decision consciously, but we both came away a little bit changed. And maybe some of it was conscious, but I would submit, for me, a lot of it was unconscious. But my trajectory was altered a little bit because of the dialogue. It wasn't about reaching agreement. It was about the dialogue. So that was...
I love what you said about trajectory, because all of us know, who have ever either fired a gun, or you, Mr. Artillery Man, know that when it leaves, when the round leaves, you change the trajectory, and it's very, very tiny. But by the time it gets down the range, it is a long way away, and that changing that trajectory. And I watched your face, Clay, because you and I talked that night after you had that conversation, and you were lighter. You had a lightness about your spirit, because you had gone in with some trepidation about the differences between the political around, and you came out of there with a lightness. There was a healingness in you that was palpable.
Mm. Thanks for reflecting that back to me. You're right. It was there. I felt we're already close, but in the morning, I felt closer, even closer, and nobody changed anybody's opinions.
No, but as you go down the road, we're going to be in such a different place because that happening.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Dennis.
Yeah, to your point about him looking lighter, I like that's one of the things I like that Marshall has to say is using words like lazy, arrogant, selfish, ignorant, wrong, stupid, incompetent to whatever are damaging to the spirit, damaging to the soul. When that word is alive in you, it's not a language of life. You don't feel aliveness. When you're doing that other thing. That's really. I'm just commenting on what you and Dennis both said. That Dennis said you looked lighter, and I'm like, wow, yeah. Having a conversation till 1 a.m. where that wasn't part of the conversation, where you'd been having. For me, I would have been having private conversations with them in my mind prior to getting together, where I used all those words in conversation with them. But to have a different reality, awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Todd, have you noticed a change in your inner self-talk? How Todd talks to Todd about Todd?
When you talk about awakening, it's, for me personally, it's an ongoing process. But one of the key, I'm going to put a pin in this idea about, by myself, I don't have enough information about the world to live the life I want to. Okay, so I'm going to stick a pin in that. And one of the bits of information I received from my wife is that she once asked me, what, because I'm having this internal dialogue that occasionally I'll actually let out, and here she gets to experience some of it.
That never happens to me.
Yeah, me neither.
But she said, well, what would you tell a friend who was dealing with the same thing? What would you say to somebody else? And in that moment, I realized that I would say things to myself that I would never in a million years to say to another human being, because they were so hateful, hurtful, vicious. And that realization has helped me along the way toward sort of having compassion on myself. And we're talking earlier about those moments when you're flooded and overwhelmed. And that's one of the other things, right? You can ask to step back while you're counting to 10 or taking a breath. That was kind of the problem I've always had with like that advice. Like, I think it's good to insert some space, but like, what are you supposed to be doing while that's going on? Because I'm just saving up more things to say. And so one of the things I discovered studying nonviolent communication is that one of the things I can do in those moments is give myself a little bit of compassion. That I say to myself, look, you are feeling really outraged by the thing you just heard because it's so important to you to, I don't know, why am I feeling outraged? But that internal dialogue is one of the key paths of internal growth for me. Dennis, does that give you a sense of kind of how
yes.
nonviolent communication's been contributing to that?
It's so lovely to hear you, Todd, and Christopher and Clay, to be able to one of the things that I love about being on In Search of the New Compassionate Male is that this search is watching souls in progress, how they evolve. I actually get to watch it. I get to watch this because it takes work and it takes intentionality in order to evolve along the line, to be more open-hearted and open-minded. It requires an opening, and that is work. It is the hardest work I can possibly do if I'm willing to do that, and to be able to have that and be vulnerable. And it's beautiful to see this. It gives me such hope when I see this happening in my life as I'm seeing it today on the screen. Anyone that's watching this, and I believe that because audio is so much deeper than just the ears, it's going to come across in the podcast and filter out into the people.
Gosh, Dennis, I totally agree with you. You know, going back, Todd, to what you were talking about earlier, is when this happens, you know, when I get this pause, what do? You know, and I was reflecting back to, 1999, something like that, going out to this thing called the HeartMath Institute. It was pretty fresh at the time, at least for me it was, and going through a workshop, and they termed it freeze frame. And it was that point where we have a choice. We don't really know that we have a choice, but that choice to pause and to find a fraction of a second where we don't go over the edge, but we choose a different path. And so there's that, the freeze frame activity, the HeartMath Institute, and that work. Stephen Covey, you know, seek to understand and then be understood. You know, the negotiations courses, you know, summarize, test understanding, give information, you know, climb to the balcony and look down, you know, observe yourself, observe what's going on. We've been talking around it, and all those have been good tools. But what I'm seeing, well, they bring it up and they give you some vocabulary, but what I'm seeing and what I'm learning with Rosenberg's work is it takes it really into a practical and really into the dialogue of how does this evolve? What does that really look like? And it gets it a step further away from theory.
How beautiful. You know, gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for giving us a chance to spend some time talking about compassion and nonviolent communication and what we're doing here on the planet. Christopher, you know what a gift you are to me, and Clay, and Todd, thank you. Thank you for joining us on this time. There is going to be an after conversation that I would include, that I would love for anyone you can stick around and get yourself a libation and enjoy this. But I am so inspired by the opportunity to be able to see that this is how men are growing, and there are more of us than we are realizing. And I want to thank you. I want to thank each of you for doing this, for being the people that you are, and for inviting me along to be the person that I am. And thank you, everyone, and we shall see you next time in search of the new compassionate male.
This is hard. Some of our conversations that we tape are just a stream of consciousness flowing. And this was hard. And I think it really makes a point of the work that we're doing. It's deep and takes a lot of thought and a lot of pausing and reflecting. And so, yeah, Todd, I deeply appreciate you taking time to be here.
Well, I'm so glad to have spent this time with all three of you, and have really enjoyed it. There are a few loose ends that we didn't get to.
Let's talk about them.
I would love it if you've got another couple of minutes.
It's open mic time.
All right.
I'll be here as long as you want to be here. But yeah, please.
We were talking about kind of the political applications or the political conversations we get in, and I gathered that each of you sort of have this sense that I do, that there's something about empathy that the world is calling for in that domain. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to talk a little more about that. I imagine it's becoming a new compassionate male. There's so many dimensions to. I'd be happy to come on another episode and talk more about just applying NVC in the political realm, because I think that is a really key need in the world right now. Not necessarily the universal NVC human needs sense, but I hear the world calling for it. And I want to give an example of a piece of wisdom that I think NVC brings to this, and it's the distinction between needs and strategies. So when Marshall talks about needs, what he's talking about is things that apply to all people everywhere all the time, or independent of time, really, I guess is what the way to say it. And so I'm going to give you an example of a strategy, which was in the previous administration. There was a strategy to build a wall on the southern border of the United States with Mexico. And that strategy was in service of a need for safety. And I have that need. I want to be safe. Right? I want the people around me to be safe. I want my family to be safe. So that's a need for me. Mm-hmm. And also, I was fundamentally opposed to that particular strategy in service of safety because I didn't think it made me any more safe. And so the thing is, all of our energy we spent talking about walls or no walls. We weren't talking about safety. We're talking about strategies, not needs. And when Marshall says, hey, I can get you to where you want to be in 20 minutes once we uncover the need, and that may take 2 years to get to the bottom of what's the real need we're trying to address. No, I don't think you ever said it would take 2 years, but it takes a lot longer than 20 minutes for most of us to actually dig that out.
Taking a couple hours to get to the needs. It really facilitating a couple.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, the more skilled we get in connecting feelings to needs so that we know what those are, the faster we can get to that 20 minutes part of it. And so, that idea of getting all tangled up in strategies without having even acknowledged what needs we're trying to meet. So that's one piece of this political puzzle. The other piece I alluded to a little while ago when I said, I don't have enough information to make the decisions of the quality that I want to be making. And so as another example, my partnership with my wife, she managed the finances in our house. And it's not that I couldn't, I just hate it. And we might be bankrupt right now because I'm a bit of an idealist about things and I could spin us into the hole. Right? So we need each other, not because we're incomplete humans without each other, but we bring perspectives that support one another in being complete humans. And I am convinced that's true of a politically liberal and a politically conservative perspective. And I have to remind myself often that people who disagree with me about matters of politics have a gift for me if I can receive it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one of the things that for me right now, like in 2021, is sort of the key battle I'm waging inside myself to not become what I hate, which is uncompassionate, toward the people I disagree with in the pursuit of being more compassionate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm longing for a more compassionate world. I'm seeing all these examples of sort of systemic uncompassion or violence, maybe we'll just call it that, and wanting to oppose them, and also like not wanting to become a despot about it, where we're just trading one dictator for another one with serving a different set of strategies.
What just came to mind was, we talk about needs, and if I'm not getting my needs met, then I'm in fear. And I don't think I don't think I could do it. If I'm deep in fear, I can't even understand the concept of compassion. Could it be possible that fear and compassion are at opposite ends of the spectrum, and you can't experience both, or can you?
I'm going to suggest you can. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there are choices to be made about who's driving. And so and also let me back up to say that asking questions about first acknowledging I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it that I'm afraid about? In my example earlier, I might be afraid of my own personal safety and security as a result of, not protecting the borders of the country. Maybe that's what I'm afraid of. And acknowledging that connection allows me to have compassion for myself. Yeah. And so that's what I'm suggesting, that if we're responding out of fear, okay, yeah, I think that often leads us away from compassion. But that doesn't mean we can't be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
I'm suggesting that acknowledging I'm afraid is part of the journey toward compassion. And that if I don't keep moving on that journey, if I just stop at the fear, respond out of fear, I, hunker down and entrench, and whether it's a conversation or physically.
Right. Well, and I think you're hitting on what I think's part of the definition of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear.
Mm.
It's the ability to take right action in the presence of fear.
Mm-hmm.
That's from what speaks to me on it. And you're right. If I can pause when I'm in fear, just the act of pausing, having enough consciousness to pause would be for me the first step in being compassionate. So you're right. I hadn't thought about it like that.
I come by this conviction that's grown in me that to not face an emotion is less than human.
Mm-hmm.
To experience emotions and not fully experience them, I'm missing out. I'm not the person I want to be. That my experience of the moment is not what I want it to be. And what do you know, if when you try to bury that stuff, it's going to find its way out. It's going to come out.
It's going to come out.
And so if it comes out in ways that you've not attended to, it's probably going to be destructive when that happens.
Yeah. I have a take on energy coming out, and I say it differently, but it's getting at the same thing, that compassion is innate. It's part of our DNA. And our natural state is a state of love. Well, compassion to me is love in action. And when I'm trained by society, by patriarchy, to shut down those feelings and hold them in, I say the very same thing. It's going to come out in one way or the other. It's going to come out real good or real bad. And I believe that that spark of compassion is there begging for us to open up and allow that to flow, and to flow in the sense, in the way that it's intended to. But shut down and leaking out, that's not so good.
In the spirit of that, I wanted to mention to you a resource by Dr. Mark Brackett. It's a book called Permission to Feel. Is that something neither of you has come across?
I'm not familiar with it.
No? So it's not necessarily aligned with nonviolent communication, but I find it helpful in my practice of nonviolent communication because of all of the work he's done to build a framework for giving yourself permission to feel whatever it is that you feel. And so his focus is really just in this one domain of emotion and experiencing emotion, but he's got some ways of sort of, in the cover of this book, there's a grid that talks about having in fact, I'm going to pull this thing up if I can find it. But the idea here is you've got these quadrants of pleasure or pain and sort of liveliness or energy sort of on the vertical, and pleasure and pain on the horizontal. And so it helps me sort of navigate this emotional landscape.
So on the bottom left, low
So I'm gonna stop this
pleasantries, and on the bottom right, high pleasantries, and then the lower side, lower half of it, low energy and high energy. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so especially when I'm trying to name an emotion that I can't think of the word for, something like this helps me kind of narrow it down, because I can usually get the pleasure, pain piece, and I can usually get the energetic piece. And so at least now I'm in a quadrant where I've not got a sea of words. I've only got, a quarter of the words I was looking at to begin with.
Oh, I so appreciate this. I'm very graphically oriented, and
I gathered from the image on the wall behind you there that that's quite the diagram.
That's my mandala.
Let me mention one more book that I don't recommend necessarily, but I think it's important to mention when we're talking about empathy and compassion. It's a book by Paul Bloom called Against Empathy, which I find objectionable in the extreme. But it turns out that what he's saying in the bulk of this book is that if we just rely on feeling empathetic, that it's not enough to serve the needs of people who are suffering, whether they're hungry in some far-flung place, whether they're imprisoned in the US, whether they're living on the street here somewhere. That if we just, because we've only got so much of that feeling to go around, you get sort of compassion fatigue. And so he's saying, look, if we're counting on that, I don't think we're going to get there. To which I say, okay, I think that's right. And also the practice of empathy and nonviolent communication is something different than that. It's not a thing you feel. It is a practice that connects you to feelings.